I've always been someone who values moments of solitude. After months of intense work, I decided I needed some time for myself. I found an Airbnb in a small coastal town that seemed perfect, cozy, secluded, and with an incredible ocean view. The listing described it as a peaceful retreat, ideal for relaxation, and the photos showed a charming cabin with rustic decor. I arrived on a sunny afternoon, and the host, a woman in her mid-50s named Linda, was there to greet me. She seemed friendly, but something about her made me slightly uncomfortable. Maybe the way she kept insisting that I enjoy the peace and always be mindful of the front door. The first night was uneventful. I went to bed early, tired from the trip, and woke up to the sound of seagulls and the salty ocean breeze coming through the window. I spent the day exploring the empty beach, reading a book on the porch, and soaking in the tranquility I'd been craving. That night, however, while making tea in the kitchen, I noticed something strange about the lock on the back door. The metal looked scratched, like someone had tried to force it open. I stared at it for a few seconds, wondering if it had always been like that, or if I just hadn't noticed before. I ended up locking all the doors again just to be safe, and tried convincing myself that it was all in my head. The next morning, while making coffee, I noticed that the door to the guest bedroom was slightly open. I was certain I had closed all the doors the night before. My heart started racing, but I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was just a draft or I was being overly paranoid. Then, I found a notebook on the nightstand in the guest room. It looked old, with a worn leather cover, and when I opened it, I saw it was full of notes. At first I thought it was some forgotten diary left by a previous guest, but then I realized the dates were recent. What made my stomach drop were the entries. Arrived around 2 p.m., blonde, hair tied in a bun, holding a book in her right hand. And further down, spent 20 minutes on the porch, looking at the ocean, seems nervous. Heart pounding, I immediately called Linda. She answered with a calm, almost annoyed tone, as if I was bothering her. When I mentioned the notebook, she let out a small, awkward laugh and said it was probably left by a previous guest, nothing to worry about. I insisted that it was strange, but she quickly brushed me off, saying the house was safe and that no one would mess with my things. The call ended, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness. That night I locked everything again and pushed a dresser in front of the bedroom door. Even then, I could barely sleep. That night, exhaustion finally overtook me, but my sleep was restless. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise coming from the kitchen. It was faint but distinct, like the creak of a door being opened slowly. My body froze, and for a few seconds, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if whoever was there didn't want to be noticed. My breathing became shallow, and every beat of my heart felt like it echoed through the room. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police. But to my horror, there was no signal. Staying put and waiting for the intruder to reach my room didn't seem like an option. I grabbed the key to the back door from the nightstand and started unlocking it as silently as possible. When I finally opened it, the cold night air hit me, and I ran outside without thinking to grab a jacket or shoes. I hid behind a bush in the backyard, trying to see through the windows what was happening inside the house. The kitchen light was on, and I saw a shadow move across the room. It was a tall figure wearing what looked like a heavy coat. The person began walking toward my bedroom, and at that moment I almost lost control of my panic. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold my phone as I tried, once again, to call the police. Thankfully, the signal returned, and I explained the situation as quickly as I could. They told me to stay where I was and assured me a patrol car was on the way. I waited what felt like hours, feeling the cold ground beneath me, and the fear growing with every passing second. When the flashing lights of the patrol car finally illuminated the driveway, I felt a wave of relief so overwhelming that I nearly cried. The officers entered the house with flashlights and weapons drawn. but to my shock and terror, they found no one. The intruder had vanished without a trace. However, as they searched the place, they discovered a hidden hatch under the kitchen rug, leading to a basement that wasn't listed in the Airbnb description. Down there, they found a single wooden chair in the center of the room, with frayed restraints on the armrests, an old camera, and a pile of notebooks identical to the one I had found. Each one was filled with detailed notes about different guests. When the officers came back from the basement, they called me over to explain what they had found. Despite shaking from the cold and fear, I went to them, still trying to make sense of everything. One of the notebooks was open, and the notes were just as unsettling as the ones I had found in the bedroom. They contained detailed descriptions of people who had stayed there, their habits, schedules, even notes about when they seemed most vulnerable. One of the officers, looking serious, asked if I had noticed anyone lurking around or anything suspicious during the day. I tried to recall any details, but my mind was a fog of panic. At that moment, Linda arrived. She seemed confused to see the patrol car, but her expression quickly changed when she learned about the basement. "I had no idea that was there," she said, but her voice shook and her eyes darted away every time someone looked at her. As the officers questioned her, I started piecing things together in my head. Why had she told me to stay mindful of the front door? Why had she reacted so oddly when I mentioned the notebook? With each second, I grew more suspicious that she knew far more than she was letting on. The officers decided to take her in for questioning at the station, but it didn't bring me the relief I had hoped for. I was still alone, in the middle of the night, in a house that now felt like the setting of a horror movie. They suggested I find another place to stay and promised to continue the investigation. I packed my things as quickly as I could and drove to a hotel in the nearest town, but the fear stayed with me. Every car headlight on the road felt like someone following me. Every noise in the hotel room made my heart race. I didn't sleep a wink. 2 days later, I got a call from the police. They had discovered that the basement wasn't just some makeshift hideout. It was a surveillance spot. Through tiny openings in the walls, you could see almost every room in the house. The most chilling discovery? They found a motion-activated camera connected to a laptop with recordings of past guests, and me from the moment I arrived. The last footage clearly showed the intruder in the kitchen, but they had escaped through the same hatch the officers had uncovered. They couldn't identify the face, but the footage was enough to open a full investigation. A few weeks later, the police called again. Despite interrogating Linda, she continued to deny any involvement, claiming the basement was already there when she bought the property years ago. However, the camera footage revealed something that made my blood run cold. Multiple times during my stay, Linda had entered the house without my knowledge. Always in the dead of night, through the basement access, she would shine a flashlight and check the rooms, including my bedroom, while I was sleeping. The officer on the phone told me they were gathering enough evidence to prosecute her, but in the meantime, she remained free. That news devastated me. I wanted to believe I was safe, that it was over, but the thought that the Airbnb host, the woman who had greeted me with a smile, was part of it all left me paranoid. For weeks, I looked over my shoulder, constantly checking locks and windows. To this day, I can't stay alone in a strange place without feeling like I'm being watched. The case was eventually closed due to a lack of evidence directly connecting Linda to the intruder or the surveillance system, but the Airbnb listing was removed, and the cabin remains abandoned to this day. I still dream about those nights, the footsteps in the kitchen, the shadow in the window. In some dreams, I can clearly see the intruder's face. In others, it's like he's still there, watching me from somewhere. No matter how hard I try, I've never been able to erase the memories of what happened. The scariest part is that, to this day, no one knows who the man in the recordings was or why he kept those notebooks. All that's left are unanswered questions, and the constant feeling that maybe he's still watching me from somewhere. I've always been the kind of person who values peace and quiet. Maybe that's why when my uncle suggested I spend a weekend at my late grandfather's old lake house, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to unwind. It was a simple wooden cabin, secluded from civilization, surrounded by dense forest and, of course, the clear lake that gave the place its name. I invited 2 friends, Mike and Ryan, to come along. The plan was simple: fishing, grilling, and cracking open a few beers. Nothing fancy, just a laid-back weekend. We arrived on Friday night. The air around the lake had a unique smell, a mix of damp wood and fresh leaves that brought back childhood memories of when my grandfather was still alive. He was a reserved man who spent most of his time alone in that cabin. My uncle never told me much about his past, but I knew my grandfather had a certain reputation for being odd in town. That night, as we unpacked, Ryan tripped over one of the floorboards and joked about the cabin being older than he imagined. It wasn't until later that we noticed that particular board was slightly loose. Curiosity got the better of us. After dinner, while we were chatting about nothing in particular, Mike suggested we check it out. It was one of those dumb ideas that only come up after a few beers, but no one objected. We grabbed a kitchen knife to pry the board up. Beneath it, we found something that immediately caught our attention: a wooden chest with rusted locks and an air of mystery that begged to be explored. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, but had clearly been placed there with care, as if someone didn't want it to be found. It took us a while to open the chest. Ryan had to use a screwdriver to force the lock. When we finally got it open, we all froze for a few seconds, staring at its contents. Inside was a pile of yellowed photographs, cassette tapes labeled by hand, and a small leather-bound notebook. The photos showed people I didn't recognize, but gave me an immediate sense of unease. Some seemed to be taken during gatherings or parties by the lake, but others had a darker tone: men exchanging envelopes, blurred faces, cars lined up in the middle of nowhere. With each photo we flipped through, the feeling that we had stumbled onto something we shouldn't have grew stronger. As we kept looking through the photos, Mike found something even stranger. Some of them showed the same lake house, but with people we didn't expect. They weren't family photos or pictures of friends fishing. They were groups of serious, almost sinister-looking people. Men in dark suits and women in formal clothing, as if attending an important meeting. Ryan, trying to lighten the mood, joked about a fisherman's cult, but no one laughed. Something in the atmosphere shifted. The peaceful silence of the lake, which had felt calming before, now felt oppressive. It was as if the cabin itself was watching us. We decided to play one of the cassette tapes. We found an old tape recorder on one of the shelves, dusty but still functional. The tape started with a low, distorted sound, like it had been recorded in a muffled room. Then a man's voice began speaking, calm but authoritative. "Tonight's meeting will be brief. We need to align on the next steps." We listened in stunned silence as he mentioned things like packages delivered, silencing curious parties, and avoiding the police. That's when Mike abruptly paused the recording, his eyes wide. "This isn't normal stuff," he said, and I knew he was right. Ryan suggested we close the chest and pretend we hadn't found it, but Mike wanted to keep digging. I was torn. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. We agreed to take a quick look at the notebook. It was a list of names, dates, and addresses, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Some of the names sounded vaguely familiar, maybe from store signs or old families in town. One of the addresses, though, was the lake house we were standing in. That was enough to send chills down all of our spines. At that moment, the sound of a branch snapping outside made us freeze. We looked at each other, silently asking the same question. "Did you hear that too?" Ryan, always the one to brag about being the bravest, went to the window. He carefully pulled back the curtain, but he couldn't see anything beyond the darkness and the faint reflection of the lake. probably just an animal," he whispered, though his tone didn't convince anyone, not even himself. From that moment on, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. After the noise outside, we tried to act like nothing had happened, but it was impossible to ignore the tension hanging in the air. We put the chest back under the floorboards, trying to forget we had ever found it. Mike suggested placing something heavy on top of the loose board just in case. I don't know if it was to prevent anyone from finding the chest or because we were too scared to leave that opening exposed. After that, we decided to go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little creak of the cabin, the groaning floorboards, the distant sound of wind through the trees felt amplified. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that made me sit up in bed instantly. It was rhythmic, like slow footsteps on the cabin floor. For a moment I thought one of my friends had gotten up, maybe to grab water or use the bathroom. But then I heard Mike mumble something in the room next to mine, and I realized they were still in bed. The sound continued, coming closer to my room. I tried convincing myself it was just the old cabin settling, but the noise was too deliberate, too clear. I decided to wake up Mike and Ryan. I knocked on their door, trying not to sound panicked, but my voice shook. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Mike opened the door, his hair messy, his face confused. "Hear what?" Before I could explain, the sound started again, louder this time. Footsteps in the living room, followed by a faint dragging noise, like something heavy being moved. Mike's eyes widened, and Ryan stepped out of his room holding a flashlight. "That's not an animal," he muttered, and for the first time that night, we were all on the same level of fear. We decided to check the living room together. Mike grabbed a piece of wood leaning against the kitchen door, as if it could protect us from whatever was out there. Ryan lit the way with his flashlight, and I followed in the middle, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The living room looked exactly as we had left it, except for one thing. The floorboard we had put back earlier was lifted again. The chest was there, its lid open, and the photos, notebooks, and tapes were scattered on the floor. But what really stopped us in our tracks were the wet footprints leading away from the chest and toward the back door. The wet footprints on the floor were impossible to ignore. They started at the chest and led to the back door, disappearing into the oppressive silence of the night outside. Ryan shone his flashlight toward the door, and we noticed it was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. None of us remembered leaving it open. Mike, still clutching the piece of wood like it was a weapon, whispered, "Someone was here. We need to leave now." I immediately agreed, but Ryan hesitated. He wasn't the type to run without understanding what was going on. "What if it's just a neighbor or something?" Ryan suggested, as if that was a comforting thought. But there were no neighbors for miles. We knew that because my uncle had made it clear how isolated the cabin was. Fear began to creep over me, and a wave of paranoia took hold. If someone had come for the chest, why leave the photos and tapes scattered everywhere? Why leave footprints? We decided to lock the back door and push a shelf against it. After that, we sat in the living room, each holding something to defend ourselves, waiting for daylight. The next few hours were the longest of my life. Every sound from outside, the creak of the porch, the faint rustle of leaves, felt like it was magnified. At one point, we thought we heard footsteps on the porch or something lightly scratching at the walls of the cabin. But every time we checked the windows, we saw nothing but darkness and the faint glimmer of the lake in the distance. Ryan eventually broke the silence, his voice low and filled with regret. "We shouldn't have messed with that chest. Whoever hid it wanted it to stay hidden." He was right, but it was too late to take it back. When dawn finally came, we left the cabin without looking back. We abandoned everything, including the chest. Once back in town, none of us talked much about what had happened. I mentioned the photos and tapes to my uncle, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he just stayed quiet for a while before saying, "Your grandfather was a complicated man." Maybe it's better if you don't dig into this anymore. I haven't been back to the lake house since, and I don't plan to. Sometimes I have nightmares about the sounds from that night and the feeling that something or someone is still there, waiting for anyone foolish enough to open that chest again. I've always been the kind of person who values family vacations, those weeks disconnected from the world, you know? Back in July 2018, my wife Sarah, our 2 kids, and I decided to rent a lakeside cabin. I had found it on a rental site, and it looked perfect. Rustic, isolated, but comfortable enough for a few worry-free days. Our youngest, Ethan, was only 8 at the time, and our daughter, Emily, was 13. We were excited to give them a break from the city. No screens, just nature. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, and the sun reflecting off the lake looked exactly like the photos. At that point, it felt like the beginning of a perfect vacation. The cabin was larger than I had imagined, with 2 bedrooms, a living room with a fireplace, and a small but well-equipped kitchen. The smell of old wood was oddly comforting, like the place had its own stories to tell. Ethan claimed the smaller bedroom, while Emily took an extra mattress in our room. We spent the first day unpacking and exploring the area around the lake. Everyone was excited, especially Ethan, who couldn't stop talking about the fish he saw near the shore. That night, we had a barbecue outside, and everything seemed normal, even idyllic. But in the back of my mind, there was something about the cabin that didn't feel right. Maybe it was the faint sensation of being watched, something I brushed off at the time. It was on the second day that things started to feel strange. Ethan came into the living room with a curious yet frightened look on his face. He was holding a small metal piece, something that looked like a screw but with what appeared to be a tiny lens on the tip. "I found this in my room," he said quietly. At first, I thought it was some old decoration or something left behind by previous renters, but Sarah was immediately suspicious. We went to Ethan's room, and he showed us a spot in the upper corner of the wall where the paint looked slightly cracked. Upon closer inspection, I noticed a hole there, and it looked freshly made. A chill ran down my spine. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some old security setup or something installed by a former owner, but Sarah insisted it wasn't normal, so I decided to investigate further. I grabbed a screwdriver and started removing the wooden panel where the hole was. Behind it, there was a small camera connected to dusty wires that disappeared into the wall. My heart raced. "This isn't normal," I murmured, while Emily and Ethan stood frozen, staring at me. It was as if the perfect cabin we'd rented had suddenly turned into something out of a horror movie. After finding that camera, the entire atmosphere in the cabin shifted. What had once felt cozy and peaceful now felt claustrophobic, like we were being watched with every move we made. Sarah suggested we call the cabin's owner immediately, which I did. He answered after a few rings and sounded surprised, or at least he tried to. "A camera? That's impossible. We never installed anything like that," he said, his voice tinged with indignation. Despite his reassurances, something didn't feel right. He insisted that maybe a previous guest had done it without his knowledge. But as we talked, I noticed something unsettling. The line began to crackle, and a faint, muffled voice echoed in the background. It was as if someone was listening in on our conversation. After the call, I decided to follow the camera's wires to see where they led. The cabin had a small basement, accessible through a narrow staircase beside the kitchen. The light down there was dim, with only a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, but it was enough to see what left me speechless. In the far corner, covered by a dusty sheet, was an old control panel filled with switches and buttons. Connected to it were small, outdated monitors, like something you'd see in old security setups. Some were off, but others flickered with static. On one of the screens, I could barely make out an image of a bedroom, the same room where Ethan had been sleeping. The feeling of being watched consumed me entirely. I ran back upstairs, unsure how to explain to my family what I had just seen. Sarah was in the living room, staring at her phone with an expression I had never seen before. Pure terror. "We just got this," she said, holding the phone out to me. It was a text from an unknown number. It simply said, "You shouldn't have touched the panel. Stay where you are. Do not leave the cabin." My blood ran cold. I tried replying, but the message wouldn't send. The signal seemed to be failing. By then, Ethan and Emily had joined us in the living room, and we all knew something was seriously wrong. From that moment on, it was a mix of paranoia and panic. I locked every door and window while Sarah kept trying to call the police, but the calls wouldn't go through. Outside, the silence of the lake felt heavy, oppressive. Every little noise, the rustling of leaves, the creak of the wood, made us jump. That's when Ethan, still clutching the camera he'd found, asked, "Does this mean they're watching us right now?" I didn't know how to answer. All I knew was that, somehow, someone was watching, and it seemed like they didn't want us to leave. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. As I tried to process everything, something outside caught my attention. Through the living room curtains, I saw a sudden flash coming from the direction of another cabin across the lake. It wasn't a flashlight or anything like that. It looked more like a direct beam, almost like a signal. "There's someone else out there," I said, pointing toward the window. Sarah and Emily joined me, but the flash had already disappeared. I felt like I needed to know what was going on, even though it was probably a terrible idea. I grabbed a flashlight and, despite Sarah's protests, stepped outside. Every step toward the lake's edge felt heavier than the last. The silence was so intense I could hear my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. When I reached the shoreline, I realized the other cabin was completely dark, with no signs of anyone being there. But as I aimed the flashlight toward the trail leading to it, I saw something that made me freeze. There were fresh footprints in the mud heading in the opposite direction, into the woods, away from the cabin. They looked recent, as if someone had passed through just minutes ago. A sharp crack from the trees made me stop. I knew I should go back to the cabin, but something pushed me to keep going. I followed the tracks for a few feet, but they abruptly disappeared, like whoever it was had vanished. That's when I heard a faint hum, almost imperceptible, coming from my left. When I turned the flashlight, I saw it. A small camera mounted on a tree, pointed directly at me. I bolted back to the cabin, my heart pounding like it was about to burst. Sarah was waiting at the door, her face a mix of fear and relief. "We got more messages," she said, her voice shaking. She handed me the phone, and I read the new texts. One said, "We warned you not to leave." Another, sent just minutes later, repeated, "Stay where you are." The tone was commanding, almost menacing. We couldn't figure out who was behind this or how they knew exactly what we were doing. Emily was crying in the corner of the living room while Ethan, still holding the camera, muttered under his breath, "They're everywhere." That's when I noticed the camera he was holding had a small button on the side, like it could connect to a system. I pressed it, and the faint hum I'd heard earlier started to echo through the cabin. The sound was coming from somewhere inside. I rushed upstairs, following the noise to Ethan's room. There was another panel in the wall, almost invisible, hidden beneath peeling wallpaper. Behind it, I found more wires and devices connected to what looked like a transmitter. It felt like the entire cabin had been rigged to record or broadcast. Before I could investigate further, the phone rang. It was the same unknown number. I answered, but there was no response. Just static, followed by a whispered voice that said, "Leave the room. Now." I dropped the phone and ran out, slamming the door shut behind me. When I looked at my family, their terrified faces said it all. I had to do something, but it felt like any decision we made would only make things worse. After the scare in Ethan's room, I knew staying in that cabin was a death sentence. We had to leave, but how? The road to the nearest town was long, and the thought of driving it in the dark felt like asking for trouble. But staying there, with my family terrified and those ominous messages, wasn't an option. I decided we'd leave at first light. I locked every door and window again and spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with a kitchen knife in hand. Every creak of the wood or gust of wind outside made me jump out of my seat. Sarah held Emily and Ethan on the couch, trying to comfort them, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. When the first rays of sunlight peeked through the trees, we packed up as fast as we could and loaded the car. As I was putting the last bag in the trunk, I noticed something chilling. Footprints around the cabin that hadn't been there before. There were several sets, and some were so close to the windows it looked like someone had been standing there, watching us all night. My breathing quickened, and for a moment I thought about going back inside. But something deep down screamed at me to keep moving. We got in the car, and I started the engine. As we began driving away, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text. "You shouldn't be leaving." I ignored it and hit the gas. As we drove down the dirt road, I noticed something in the trees. A vehicle following us, keeping its distance but close enough to make its presence known. Sarah noticed it too, her panic rising. "Drive faster, please," she begged, clutching the kids tightly. I pushed the car as fast as the winding road allowed, but it was hard to keep up the speed. Suddenly the vehicle stopped and disappeared into the woods. We didn't dare slow down, not until we reached the main highway. Finally, when we saw signs of civilization, we felt a wave of relief. I called the police and explained what had happened, but, unsurprisingly, they found nothing when they investigated the cabin. To this day, I don't know who was watching us or why. The cabin was removed from the rental site a few weeks later, and the owner stopped responding to our messages. Sometimes I think about that hidden camera and the control panel in the basement, wondering how many other families had been recorded before us. Sarah refuses to talk about it, and luckily the kids have forgotten most of it. But for me, every time I see a security camera, I get this eerie feeling, like someone, somewhere, is still watching us. Maybe I'll never know the full truth, but one thing is certain. I'm never renting an isolated cabin again. Me and Sarah always liked escaping the city on weekends, so when she found a cheap Airbnb at a countryside farmhouse, it seemed like the perfect choice. It was early fall, with that crisp weather, golden leaves scattered along the roads, and the promise of a quiet place to relax. The listing showed a charming house with a wooden porch and endless fields in the background. The host seemed helpful in the messages, too. He mentioned the place was isolated but safe, perfect for couples looking for peace and quiet. It sounded ideal for us. Everything felt like just another ordinary weekend. When we arrived, the farmhouse looked exactly like the pictures, but there was one detail that hadn't been mentioned in the listing: an old crumbling barn behind the main house. The windows and door were boarded up with uneven, weathered planks, giving it a creepy, abandoned vibe straight out of a horror movie. The host, an older man named Mr. Tom, was there to greet us. He was friendly but very firm when he pointed at the barn and said, "Don't go in there no matter what. It's been locked up for years and full of dangerous junk." We laughed it off. Who in their right mind would want to explore a place like that? The house we rented was cozy enough, with a big fireplace in the living room and a comfortable bed. The barn quickly left our thoughts. The first night was peaceful, for the most part. We sat on the porch, stargazing, talking, and sipping wine. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the chirping of crickets. But around 2 in the morning, just as we were falling asleep, we heard something coming from outside. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I got up and looked out the bedroom window but didn't see anything. Sarah woke up and asked what it was. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying not to sound alarmed. But the sound continued for a few more minutes before stopping abruptly. The next morning, as we were having coffee on the porch, Sarah noticed tracks in the dirt near the house. They looked like something, or someone, had been dragging something toward the barn. I tried to rationalize it, saying it could have been a deer or maybe even a stray dog. But the tracks were too straight, too deliberate, like someone had carefully pulled something in that direction. It unsettled me, but I didn't let it show. I shrugged it off, and we spent the day exploring the surrounding fields. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the barn was watching us, standing silent and ominous in the distance. During the day, we tried to distract ourselves with a walk through the fields nearby. The area was beautiful, with a peacefulness that felt frozen in time. But even while we admired the scenery, the barn lingered at the back of my mind. Sarah seemed restless too, though she didn't say much. We returned to the house at dusk, and as we prepared dinner, we heard the same sound from the night before. This time, it was louder and clearer, like something, or someone, was moving inside the barn. "You heard that, right?" Sarah asked, setting the knife she was using down. I nodded but tried to downplay it. "Probably just the wind or some animal," I replied. But deep down, I was starting to feel uneasy too. Later that night, as we sat in the living room, another noise broke the silence. This time it wasn't the dragging sound. It was lighter, like footsteps crunching on dry grass. I went to the window, but even with the dim porch light, I couldn't see anyone. I grabbed the flashlight we'd brought for emergencies and pointed it toward the barn. Nothing. But then, as I turned the flashlight off, I swear I saw a faint glow coming from inside the barn, as if someone had lit something in there. "Sarah, I think someone's out there," I whispered. She turned pale, but instead of panicking, she suggested we call the host. We called Mr. Tom, and he answered quickly, almost like he'd been expecting it. "Are you sure you locked the house?" he asked, his tone much more serious than before. We confirmed that we had, and he said he'd come by in the morning to check things out. The way he spoke only made the whole situation feel worse. We tried to ignore it and went to bed early, but in the middle of the night, a loud thud woke us up. It sounded like something had hit the outer wall of the house. I got up instantly, my heart pounding. Sarah was already awake, staring at me with wide eyes. I grabbed the flashlight and, against my better judgment, went to the door. When I opened it, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I shined the flashlight around, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then I saw something that hadn't been there before. Handprints smeared in dirt on the porch railing, right next to the door. They were fresh and perfectly placed, like someone had tried to push the door open. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I locked the door again, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Whoever, or whatever it was, they had been close. Too close. The next morning, we barely slept, waiting anxiously for Mr. Tom to arrive. When he finally showed up, he looked more serious than he had the day before. We told him about the noises, the handprints on the porch, and the light inside the barn. He listened carefully, but to our surprise, he didn't seem shocked. "That's why I told you not to go near the barn," he said, as if that explained everything. I pressed him, asking directly if he knew what was going on, but he brushed it off, saying the place was old and tended to attract nosy people. That only made me more suspicious. Before leaving, he reminded us again to stay away from the barn and suggested we spend the day out exploring. But the way he left, glancing over his shoulder, made the air feel even heavier. Despite his warning, the barn seemed to call to us. The day dragged on, and Sarah looked just as uneasy as I felt, torn between curiosity and common sense. When night fell, the sounds returned, louder than ever. It was impossible to ignore now. A mix of dragging, footsteps, and what sounded like faint whispers. Sarah was pale, clearly scared, but she was the one who said it first. "We have to see what's going on." I hesitated, but deep down I knew she was right. We grabbed the flashlight and decided to go together. Every step toward the barn felt wrong, like we were crossing a line we weren't supposed to cross. As we got closer, I smelled it before I saw anything. A metallic, rancid odor, like rust mixed with something rotten. The planks on the barn were old and weathered, but the door looked like it had been tampered with recently, with scratches and splintered edges. I pushed the door carefully and it creaked loudly, breaking the stillness of the night. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, and the flashlight revealed a scene that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just full of junk like the host had said. There was a mattress on the ground, clearly used recently, and scattered food wrappers. But the worst part was in the corner, a makeshift altar with unlit candles, and a strange wooden object covered in carved symbols. As we tried to process what we were seeing, footsteps echoed behind us. We froze in place, the sound getting closer, deliberate, like whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. Sarah gripped my arm tightly and I turned the flashlight toward the door. There was no one there, but the footsteps didn't stop. They started circling the barn. "We need to leave now," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. Sarah nodded, and we began backing away slowly, trying not to make any noise. Just as we reached the door, something fell inside the barn. A loud, metallic crash, like something had been thrown. We didn't look back. We ran to the house as fast as we could.